Welcome back. It sure was a spectacle, but what, if anything, does the election of a Democrat to the United States Senate from, of all places, Alabama mean for politics on the Suncoast and the rest of Florida? Cutting to the chase, does it mean the conventional wisdom that Democrats have no shot at winning a congressional seat on the Suncoast and other ruby red areas of Florida, or is this a one-off? Was Roy Moore simply an alleged child molester, and combined with his extreme views on politics, race, religion, sexual orientation, culture, too much for Alabama voters to digest this time around? Joining us for more is Kathy Antunes of WSRQ Radio and the founder of the RevolutionaryAct.com, Rod Thompson, who also happens to be the president of the Sarasota Republican Club. But Rod, why don't you tell us what is the RevolutionaryAct.com?
The RevolutionaryAct.com is a website that I founded about a year ago. Now has multiple writers for it, including writers from the Gulf Coast. And the name comes from the book by George Orwell, 1984, in which he says, in a time of universal lies, telling the truth is the Revolutionary Act.
You know what? Maybe I could be one of your columnists.
Sure. Submit me something and I'll see.
Well, that's really definitive. All right. So, you know, all over the country and in Florida and on the Suncoast, people are trying to read the tea leaves. What does this mean? And the question is this a one-off that even for Alabama, especially with the child molestation allegations, Alabama voters, especially Alabama women, were not going to vote for Roy Moore? Or does this show something more? Rod?
It's a one-off. In this case, a couple more reasons because beyond that, because Roy Moore was probably the weakest in the Republican field to face a Democrat in the general election. He had negatives in Alabama. He won the Republican primary, but he had real negatives in Alabama already because of his previous fairly extreme stances that a lot of moderate Republicans weren't on board with, like not having a Muslim in Congress, that sort of thing that people are just really not comfortable with. So he was already weakened. Then when you have these, you know, somewhat credible sexual misconduct accusations against him, even though they're 40 years old, particularly, I'm going to say particularly among conservative Republican women voters, that's a really big hurdle. You combine all that together, and they didn't come out all at once. They come out one after another after another. It kept adding up. And the last thing, his responses were awful. When he appeared on Sean Hannity, he totally fumbled his explanations of it. So I think it's really a one-off, a kind of perfect storm there.
Kathy, some in the Democratic Party might say that, look, not just this election, but you also look at the governor's race in Virginia and New Jersey, and Democrats are energized in a way that the party has not seen in a good long time.
Yeah, you know, I would agree with Rod in that you can't assume this is a sea change, but there's a significant opening here. And, you know, essentially, I wouldn't say those allegations were somewhat credible, actually. I think there's real concern among women. We're having more than a moment. We're having a real reckoning in terms of how we want to be led as a nation, but also, you know, what we have been promised versus what's been delivered with this administration in Washington there's been a real problem.
And we only have a few seconds left, but to that end, a new poll comes out today, the Monmouth poll, that shows that the president's job approval rate is down to 32%. You would imagine it may be higher around here, but there must be some kind of erosion if nationally it's down to 32%.
Well, one would assume, I mean, we see polls kind of all over the place. Monmouth is one of them. Rasmussen is one nobody on the left likes.
Yes, because it's not accurate.
Okay, well, okay, that's one possible take on it. But the problem with reading any of those polls is that he was unpopular before he won election, too. And that was a unique election with a very weak Democrat candidate. But I think that what you see with Trump is a very difficult president to poll when it comes to trying to extrapolate what that could mean during an election.
All right, we have to take a quick break. We are just getting warmed up. We'll have much more on the Alabama Senate race right after we check the First Alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about the Alabama Senate race and whether there are lessons to be learned here on the Suncoast. And joining us for more is Kathy Antunes of WSRQ Radio and the founder of the RevolutionaryAct.com, Rod Thompson. You know, in both Alabama and on the Suncoast, Republicans enjoy a considerable voter registration advantage. So from that perspective, Kathy, do you, why wouldn't Democrats think that if we are energized and you might be up against a depressed Republican electorate a year from now, maybe they can win?
Yeah, I think there's opportunity there, but Democrats are going to have to get their game face on and do a much better job of messaging than they have been. You know, this tax plan, for instance, that's coming down the pike, in the past 35 years, it's been Republican administrations that have blown huge holes in the deficit. And as someone who first cast a presidential ballot for Ronald Reagan,
Rod is covering his face there.
Well, but this is a real concern.
But when it comes to messaging, Charles Barkley, the former NBA star, he helped out Doug Jones in Alabama, and he had this message to Democrats last night. Let's take a look.
This is a wake-up call for Democrats. Your Democrats, and I told Mr. Jones this, and I love Doug, they've taken the black vote and the poor vote for granted for a long time. It's time for them to get off their ass and start making life better for black folks and people who are poor. They've always had our votes, and they have abused our votes, and this is a wake-up call. We got it in a great position now, but this is a wake-up call for Democrats to do better for black people and poor white people.
Frankly, I've heard the same thing on the Suncoast. Rodney Jones, the president of the NAACP in Manatee County, said to me that a lot of people thought their lives would become better when Obama became president. It didn't. A lot of young African Americans are ambivalent about politics in general. So where is the message of Democrats on the Suncoast and throughout Florida? I
think a fraud has been perpetuated, frankly, by the Republican Party for the past 35 years because if trickle-down economics worked, it would have worked by now. We haven't seen it worked. I think it's a big fraud, and the Democratic Party needs to get much better at communicating a simple economic message and actually delivering benefits to people who deserve it most.
So where are your smart people? Where are your smart people in the back offices of the Florida Democratic Party coming up with that coherent message?
I honestly can't speak to that. You know, I'm not in those rooms, but I just think, you know, there's a talk out there about how the Republican strategists are marketing majors and that the Democratic strategists are policy wonks. It's no good to be a policy wonk if you can't communicate it to the public and leverage your expertise into votes. You know, and what we've seen is that the Republican Party is really great at messaging, but terrible at delivering.
Rod, let me ask you along those lines. A lot of Republicans look at the tax plan that's in Washington as America gets a tax break. Obviously, the stock market is doing terrific. But there are a whole lot of people who are watching us right now who are not fully participating in the stock market. They don't have 401ks. And a tax cut in the GOP plan, some $1,100 for a family of four, you know, a lot of people might think that is chump change. So where is the Republican message when you face that kind of Democratic opposition?
So the stock market is only one measure of how the economy is doing, and not a particularly important one in my mind. Of course, you have GDP that's it's well above expectations. You have unemployment rate, which is lowest it's been since 2000.
Sure.
You have a lot of good stuff that's going on that should be affecting everybody to some degree. And so the fact is, in the tax plan, the challenge there is, if you believe, like conservatives like I do, that if you put more taxes out of government and into private hands, the market mechanisms will goose the economy, and more people will be employed, more people will be paying taxes. Eventually that tax cut gets more than paid for. And that helps everybody. However, that philosophy can only be accomplished if the tax cuts are actually enough to goose the economy, and that can only be done at the top end because that's where all the taxes are being paid.
Kathy.
And that's facts.
You know, the reality is the goodies are being portioned to the top, less than, it's 1/10 of 1%, and corporations. What Trump promised was that corporations and the wealthy would pay their fair share, but what we're seeing now is that the alternative minimum tax on corporations is being repealed, that the loopholes aren't being closed, and it's possible that something like GE in 2010 with $14 billion in profits paying absolutely no federal tax, he's setting the table for that. That's not going to help us. This plan is assuming a 3% growth in GDP, And that's also not reasonable.
So there we've covered messaging and the tax plan.
I wanted to come back to one thing she said earlier, if I could.
Yeah.
She said about Republican presidents have blown a hole in the deficit. That's an astonishing statement considering that our deficit under Obama in 8 years went from 10 trillion to 20 trillion.
Why?
And Obama is a Democrat.
Why is that?
Why is what?
Why did the deficit explode?
Because he continued to push for spending far more than we brought in. You simply
What did he inherit?
He inherited the first year or two. He inherited something that was already being fixed when he came into office due to something he voted for as a senator too. That was fixing the financial situation and the whole surrounding the real estate
10 seconds
collapse.
to respond to that, and then I want to move on to something else.
Yeah, you know, the Republicans, Jack Kemp in 35 years ago said, the Republican Party is no longer the party that bows at the shrine of a balanced budget. That was 20 years later, he tried to walk it back and warn George W. Bush about the ballooning deficit. And it was Dick Cheney who famously said to Paul O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter anymore.
Okay. Rod, what lesson, if anything, is somebody who helps run the Republican Party in Sarasota, you're an influential force. What would you tell your fellow Republicans around here in terms of a lesson out of Alabama that you're personally concerned about?
All right, a couple of things, and that's a great question. One is we have to have candidates of high personal integrity and character. We started running away from that as a country during the Clinton years when we decided that politics was more important than personal character, and we tried to separate a person's individual morality from their public policy. I don't think you can do that. It's the same person. So we have to be recruiting and running people who are, not perfect people, but are people that are high in integrity and high moral people, have good character and a track record of good character. The second thing is, I think Republicans, we don't have a large minority community here, but I think Republicans need to actively be going out and talking to the Black and Hispanic communities and explaining to them why conservative principles are better for them and their families than the longtime liberal principles, because I think that's a winner if they can go out and do it personally, which they don't do enough of.
To your point, Carlos Curbelo, who is a Republican congressman from Miami, tweeted today, the people of Alabama put country first tonight by rejecting the disgusting Roy Moore. Congratulations to the Bannon wing of the GOP for gifting a seat to Senate Democrats in one of the reddest states. You have no future in our country's politics. But Kathy, what lesson do you talked about your concern about Democratic messaging. Give Democrats some reason to believe that this made the beginnings of something good for the midterms?
Well, there's certainly an opening here and an opportunity because there's great concern about this tax plan and Trump. But again, you've got to bring it home on a level that people can understand. It'd be great if rational Republicans were following conservative principles. The reality is they don't, and they're actually enacting policies that benefit only a very few and corporations. Democrats need to leverage that reality. They need to talk about it more and make people understand, the working man who basically went with Donald Trump, that they're going to actually follow through and improve life for those folks.
We have less than 90 seconds, but Rod, one more question to you. What impact does the tighter margin in the Senate have on any ability of the Republicans to get anything through? Put aside the tax plan right now because Jones may not be seated by the time it's voted on. But there was one story today that Doug Jones' odds-defying victory is handing Democrats a vanishingly rare Senate win in the Deep South, and it scrambles President Trump's legislative agenda for the coming year.
I'd say theoretically it's 50% harder because, as we've talked about before, that slight vote margin that Republicans have in the Senate is so easily outdone by a liberal Maine Republican and an anti-Trump Republicans that it is so very difficult. I'm still going to be sort of surprised that they can get this tax plan through because of that. When you make that instead of a 2-vote margin, a 1-vote margin, oh, that's ridiculously thin for either party to deal with.
We have to take a quick break, and we'll have final thoughts when we return. And our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. Kathy, I'll start with you. What do you take out of the Alabama Senate race? Is it just like, a bad guy got his due, or do you look for things to change here on the Suncoast or throughout Florida?
Yeah, well, certainly a bad guy got his due, but I think there may be something more there because we saw President Trump try to move votes and he was unsuccessful.
More did come back after the president started getting more involved.
Yeah, I think it's going to be important for Democrats and rational Republicans, independents. I was an independent for 34 years. We've got to be talking about reality and what's going on with the budget and people's lives in this country. The Democratic Party has to talk to working people, and Republicans who care about the future of this country have to get real about this tax plan, the deficit, what it's going to do to people's lives. We're having a moral reckoning in this country, certainly over sexual harassment, but also, is this the kind of man we want in the White House? You know, the criminal investigations that are going on. And I think we need to leave the partisan stuff behind and start really looking at candidates as people and what are they really going to accomplish. This is a pivotal time in our country. I have cast ballots for both sides. I voted for Ronald Reagan. John Adams said facts are stubborn things. We have to start looking at reality, looking at each other as fellow citizens and having better conversations and decisions.
Rod, you ever vote for a Democrat?
I did.
Who?
Jimmy Carter. I was in college at Michigan.
Do we have the breaking news?
Wow.
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy
I was
Carter.
in college, and I sucked in all of the drivel at Michigan State University about how you couldn't trust a cowboy.
Bastion of liberalism.
It was a university. Everybody I knew there was liberal, and I didn't know any better because I was apolitical at the time. So I did. Very ashamed of that vote. But I corrected it 4 years later. To me, on the tax package, we had to lower the corporate tax rate. We had the highest one among all of our competitors in Westwood. We had to. No, you had your say. That we had to do that, number one. Number two, we talk about unfairness, that the rich aren't paying their fair share. They pay way more than their fair share. They're paying most of the taxes. They're carrying most of the load. The bottom 50% pay 1.5% of income taxes. So that's a no-go, too. I think we can learn a lot from Alabama. But one of the things we can learn from practically every election that I pay attention to, if conservative Republicans run on conservative principles and don't play games trying to slice and dice the electorate in certain ways, Hispanics, women, gays, and win it that way, if they just say conservative principles are better for everyone, that's a winning message.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you to both of you. Okay. FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest local breaking news, don't forget to download the new updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, it's because it's expired. Just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank both our guests for being here tonight. Kathy Antunes of WSRQ Radio and the founder of the RevolutionaryAct.com, Rod Thompson.